Well, this is going to be a very interesting study on Joshua, one of the most interesting studies in the Old Testament, that is for sure, and it will all be backed up with the calendar study in the Gospels. It will be divided into 3 parts, and this is specifically about Joshua's first observance of Wave Sheaf in the land of Canaan. A very interesting study. And of course, this teaching is brought to you from Yah's Covenant Calendar. It was approximately the year of 1451 BC, just after Moses died. We all know that Joshua had a very large responsibility to walk in the boots of Moses, and he did so very, very carefully. So in this part 1, we're going to be looking at some of the chapters between Joshua 1 to 5, about those spies that went into the land, about Rahab and what she had to say about crossing the Jordan. Just a lot of things are happening, but especially this particular study is about the placement of Wave Sheaf. Now, we have done this before many times, but this particular study is a revision from the original one that we gave in 2018. And all of the studies have a lot of extra examples from Joshua, but there's some really interesting things that happen here in the Joshua study. There are 3 interesting patterns of counting to 3. And believe it or not, when you learn to count to 3, it makes a whole big difference when you get into the 3 days and the 3 nights. So there's some very interesting things that are happening around that pattern. There's also going to be some comparisons between what Joshua is showing us and, I'm going to say, the popular Enoch, Zadok, Essene calendars that traditionally most of them have in common, I think all of them, a 364-day year, okay? But we're going to be comparing what Joshua does with Wave Sheaf according to what these Dead Sea Scroll calendars do with Wave Sheaf. Now, there's a lot of varieties between the 3 of them, and lots of similarities as well, but just going to be comparing with Wave Sheaf today, and I will just use a common term of Enoch just to kind of describe all of them. So it's not just one Enoch calendar. There's also going to be a little bit of work on how Joshua shines when it comes to the lunar Sabbath reckoning type of counting for calendar. So Tim is going to be helping with those particular slides. And in the end, we're going to have a very solid confirmation on exactly where this statute of Wave Sheaf is going to be placed. There's going to be no conflict whatsoever. Anyway, a restoration of Yahuah's calendar. Yes, we believe absolutely there has to be a full restoration of his calendar. It's one of those important points that before he comes, because it's going to show us many, many things. And there's a lot of people that want to follow in the footsteps of Yahuah, and they want to respond in worship and adoration. They want to honor the sabbatical worship statutes and festivals the way that he asked us to in those instructions of the Torah. But the enemy is very, very clever. Over the many, not just decades, thousands and millennium of years, he's managed to get many of Yahuah's sincere followers sidetracked when it comes to honoring Yahuah's appointed times. And what happens is often they give homage to man's pagan traditions and those counterfeit festal calendars that have replaced many of the divine appointments, if not all of them. And, I hear so many people today, I just heard it yesterday, saying, I just want to know the truth. I just want to know the truth. But when it comes to calendar, they just say, I don't know how to figure it out. There is so much confusion there. So definitely there needs to be a restoration of Yah's calendar. But it's a huge task. And it has been in the search engines of many for a long time. And this is one restoration that we're going to look at today. The good news is that there are a few that believe that Yah's perfect calendar is being restored through a very careful search of the scriptures. And there's even better news than that. Yahuah's divine calendar, it's simple, it's easy, it's logical and elegant. And yes, I want to say it's elegant and very, very, very easy to keep and beautiful. Well, there are some things to consider about restoration. Even though the weekly Sabbath has been restored to commence at dawn rather than sunset or midnight or sunrise or who knows what, even noon. Some are saying that the Sabbath starts at the high noon hour. And there's some things to consider about restoration, even though the commencement of the new month has been restored, just counting to 30 instead of searching for the barley ripeness or looking for those lunar phases. And there are some things to consider about restoration, even though the commencement of the new year has been restored by waiting for the spring equinox to usher out the old year through the observation of the shadow sign. And then we begin the new year on the very next day. So there's no waiting for confirmation of a moon phase or the barley ripeness or what's happening over in Jerusalem. We just go to the spring equinox and watch for that shadow sign that tells us that's the last day of the circuit of the sun in that path. And then we start the next day as the new year. But I do want to mention right here, spring equinox is not always on March the 20th, as I have heard recently. Sometimes it's the 19th, sometimes it's the 20th, the 21st. And if you go way back into the records of when Yahuah was on the earth, it was even March the 22nd. So spring equinox is not always March the 20th. Okay, that does not mean that the first day of the new year on the Roman calendar is always March 21. So I want you to take note of that, because that's what's going on out there in the world today, talking about that. Well, there are some things to consider about restoration, and there still can be a lot of confusion over the placement of the Wave Sheaf Festival, which ultimately is going to affect the placement of Pentecost, which follows 50 days later. So if you don't get the first one right, you won't get the second one right. If Wave Sheaf is on the wrong date, so will Pentecost be on the wrong date. And you know, there is a lot of people that say Wave Sheaf needs to have restoration. You know, could that really be so? In fact, I've been at feast camps where I have said, isn't today a Wave Sheaf, first fruits? Nobody's talking about it. And we go through the whole day and we're eating breakfast and dinner and nobody has said a thing. And you know what? People will say, well, it doesn't really matter, you know, because Wave Sheaf isn't that important anyway. And my feast camp never pays any much attention to the Wave Sheaf Festival. So you know what? It really isn't that crucial. Well, I always wondered about that. Why aren't we celebrating Wave Sheaf? Well, the reason was nobody knew what it meant. They didn't know. Nobody has taught. I've never really heard anything about what is the importance of Wave Sheaf. This study is going to show you actually at the really good part. It's going to be in part 2. So if there's any question about the placement of Wave Sheaf and Pentecost, the best thing to do is check with scripture. And today we're going to do that. So Joshua will walk us through the proper placement of Wave Sheaf through the wonderful encounter that Israel experienced when they finally entered the land of Canaan after 40 full years. And I would like to just make a mention here that sometimes Wave Sheaf is known as first fruits during the Passover festival. So it's a little bit of an interchangeable term between Wave Sheaf and first fruits. So when you see one, you can kind of think of the other, although there's a little bit of difference too. But what are some Wave Sheaf festival options? Well, we're going to examine 2 ways that the Wave Sheaf festival is celebrated. And like I said, no matter what day the Wave Sheaf is celebrated on, the 50-day Omer count is going to establish the placement of Pentecost, and it will always be on the same day of the week as Wave Sheaf. Both are affected equally. So this study is going to offer 2 options. Does Wave Sheaf follow the first of unleavened bread on Abib 16? Or is Wave Sheaf going to follow the weekly Sabbath, within the Passover festival, or neither. We're going to find out where the neither comes in. But which one is it? Or is it none of these? We're going to take a look and see. Now, there are several testimonies for the proper placement of wave sheaf. And for a long time, it seemed like Leviticus 23 and Numbers 15 were the only witnesses for proper placement of this wonderful festival. At least that's what we thought. Well, there are 3 more very strong additional witnesses from Scripture. Plus, there is some secular historical information that help us to understand this divine placement of wave sheaf. So Leviticus 23 and Numbers 15 are the major sources that we'll be using today. And the second source is Exodus 12, chapter 16, and chapter 19. That is a really great study for the placement of wave sheaf and, of course, for the Pentecost study. And then Joshua chapters 3 to 5. That's where we're going to be working today. There is a fourth witness. You'll find it in the Gospels, including the Wednesday crucifixion, the Sabbath resurrection, and the first day ascension. And then there is another witness. It is the secular historical account around Rashbeit, and there is a quote from Julian Morgenstern, very interesting quote. That's going to be in part 3. So there is a lot of evidence in the scriptures for the placement of wave sheaf. But today, this study is going to cover Leviticus and Numbers. And we're going to have a complete set of counting to 3. And there will be 3 sets, in fact. But we're going to work in part number 1 today, Leviticus and Numbers. And part 2 will be Joshua. And part number 3 will be the history. And that's what we're looking for, is that statement from the Hebrew Union College in the United States. I believe it's from Ohio. You'll be wanting to see that in part 3. So Joshua's study, it is going to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Passover in the year that he crossed the Jordan was on the weekly Sabbath or on Abib 14. It is going to show that the Unleavened Bread Sabbath was on Abib 15 that year. And he is also going to show that the wave sheaf is placed on Abib 15, not Abib 16. There is a lot of feast camps out there that say wave sheaf is always and only on Abib 16, and that's it. There's no other place for it. But Joshua today is going to show you something different. So the question is, are you ready? And here we go. And we're going to have some team teaching by Tim. He's got a couple of slides here, and we'll just kind of exchange it back and forth. So thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Charlene. No observance of wave sheaf in the wilderness. Because of Israel's sin with the golden calf, a whole new set of laws for the Aharonic priesthood, sanctuary services, and sacrificial laws were commanded upon the people. Shortly after the sanctuary was raised up, Israel sinned again by refusing to enter Canaan based upon the evil report of the 10 spies. Since Moshe could not be leading the children into the land of Canaan, Yahuah did give explicit instructions on how to observe the first wave sheaf upon their entrance. And again, there were no rehearsals for wave sheaf in the 40 plus years of the wilderness. The first observance of the spring feasts, and this is in Canaan, Joshua was preparing to take the lead. Joshua 24, verse 15, you'll see that. And please note, this study is based on the day beginning with dawn, not sunset. That is of ultra importance. Joshua will show the exact day of the week for the observance of, number 1, Passover on Abib 14. Yes, it was on the 7th day Sabbath. Number 2, wave sheaf. That is on Abib 15, not 16. And you're going to see that clearly. Number 3, the first day of unleavened bread, and that is on Abib 15. That is today, the first Shabbat of unleavened bread. This information is necessary to understand the following charts, and we are now ready to launch into three patterns of counting. 1, 2, 3. Is it simple? Appears that way, but it sure wasn't when we were first setting this up. We had to learn how to count to 3. Does it sound kind of funny? Yeah, it does, but that's the fact.
Yeah.
Joshua
But we're
1.
going to make it fun.
Yeah.
Okay, there's going to be 7 charts, and we'll go through them one by one. I think they'll really help you a lot. But in Joshua chapter 1, he is preparing the people to get ready to cross. And in those 9 verses, Joshua's book begins with a divine commission to go in and take the land of Canaan. And the promise is given in verse 3 that wherever the soles of their sandals tread, the land was going to be reserved for Israel. And then in the verses of 10 to 22, Joshua gives commands to the officers for taking the land. And verse 11 is a very interesting verse. It says, "Pass through the camp and command the people, saying, prepare provisions for yourselves, for within 3 days you will cross over this Jordan to go in to possess the land which Yahuah your Elohim is giving you to possess." So we'll just follow the boxes here. Right now, we are assuming that the very first day that Joshua was given this command was a 6th cycle of Friday on Abib 6. And all of these charts are going to make this assumption as we work up to our count for Abib 14. We're not going to hold you in suspense, but all the way through, it is an assumption until we actually prove it, going through all of the steps from Joshua. So right here in the first box, we have Joshua crossing over the Jordan in 3 days is what the instructions were given. And these 3 days do not include Abib 6. So we have our 3 days set out right there. It is going to start counting the next day, of course, at the dawn start of the day. You have to start your timeline where it needs to be, for one thing. We're going to see how that works. But anyway, after the 3rd day, Israel will cross into the Jordan. That was the promise that was given. So there is your first set of counting to 3. Just keep this all in mind. But will the calendar events actually start from Abib 6? We're going to take a look at that as well. Tim, will you give us some review? We have these review slides all the way through.
Okay, Joshua will confirm Abib 14 is the weekly Shabbat. And this will be seen very, very clearly as we go through this. You look on the right-hand side, you'll see number 14 colored in blue, and it is the Shabbat. Therefore, by default, Abib 1 must be a first cycle, or a Sunday, in the year when Yisrael enters the land. Why do we state this? What is so important to understand that Abib 1 was on the first cycle of the week in this venture of Joshua entering Canaan? Is this important? Why do I stress this? Well, you're going to see it is ultra important to understand that the first day of the year was on the first cycle of the week. Abib 10 is a special day and date as well. And we're going to be looking more into this. So I ask you, why was that so important? Joshua's calendar year does not follow the Enoch year. Enoch calendar claims that Abib 1 is always, without exception, on the 4th cycle of the week. They claim that the midday of the week always starts the new year. However, there's a serious problem with that when you line it up with Scripture, because the Scripture does not agree with Enoch's proclamation. It is very, very different. Only in the Enoch months 3, 6, 9, and 12, will the 14th day of the month align with the 7th-day Sabbath of the week? So if we look at this event of Joshua going into Canaan, that 14th day of which was Passover was on the Shabbat. How come that Enoch claims different? Why? Does he agree with the scripture, or is it a separate message altogether?
And I did see that Tim emphasized always, and I'm okay with that because there's a lot of Enoch calendars that do have this condition, but there are some Enoch calendars that actually do start their year on the first day of the week as well. But the majority of them, I think the most popular ones, start on the midst of the week. So there's, like I said, there's variations. But anyway, this is the slide taken from the Enoch Zadok video that we had seen here a couple of years ago. And it says that there's 52 Sabbaths per year, and they have these repeating patterns. So we want to look and see, is there a Sabbath that exists on the 14th cycle of the first or second month of this Enoch Zadok calendar? Well, you can see month 1 there. It's very easy to see. They've got their Sabbaths laid out as the 4th, the 11th, the 18th, and the 25th. And you can see that month 4 and 7 and month 10, they all are exactly the same. But there is no 14th that is listed as a Sabbath here. Well, there are some that say, but this Passover that Joshua was observing was the second Passover. It wasn't the first one. So, well, we may as well look at the second month as well. And is there a 14th there? No. And you can see that month 2, 5, 8, and 11, none of them have a 14th as a Sabbath. But look what happens in month 3. There you can find a Sabbath on the 14th, but we do know there's no Passover celebration in the 3rd month. So we know that there is no weekly Sabbath existing on the 14th cycle of the first or the second calendar months in Enoch. So that right there disqualifies Enoch to a large degree. Now, we have always said, if there is one problem with a calendar count, then what about all the rest of the calendar? So that's one problem. Anyway, let's look at Joshua chapter 2. This is about Rahab and the spies. And the spies are going to receive their instructions to hide 3 days in the mountains, according to Rahab. So it appears that Joshua fully expected the spies to complete this assignment on the day season of Friday. This is where he sent his spies out. It was on a Friday, the 6th cycle. And I think he expected them to just go over there and check it out and to get straight back for Sabbath. But it didn't work that way. The plans were delayed because there was some suspicions going on from the residents of Jericho. They weren't really quite too sure about these 2 men that came in. Now, no doubt they had heard about Israel and marching through the land. Well, Rahab decides that she's going to hide the spies. You know, the deal that she made with them. And it says here in box 4 that Jericho gates close when it is dark. And Rahab declares that the spies left before the gates were closed, even though she had them hidden. So there's an indication that the gates were closing at dark. But Rahab did not send them away until it was dark. The 3 days for the spies commenced from the very time that they fled to the mountains. It did not start at dawn. So this is where our count for the 3 days begins, when she actually sent them out. So there they are. They have gone out after dark, and they are now going to hide 3 days in the mountains, all the way up to the night of Abib 9. Well, look where that brings you, right up to the very end of the dusk, because it would have been night, of Monday, Abib the 9th. So that is your second set of counting to 3. You'll just kind of note where these counts begin and where they end, because that's really important as well. Okay, Joshua chapter 3. The spies are going to return. they're going to return, we're saying, on Monday, Abib night, ninth at the evening, towards night. It says in Joshua 3:2, and it came to be after 3 days that the officers went into the midst of the camp. It was a busy night for Abib 9, very, very busy. Joshua 3:3 says, and they commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant of Yahuah your Elohim and the priests, the Levites bearing it, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. And early on Abib 10, that would be Tuesday morning, in Joshua 3:1, it says, and Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim and came to cross the Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and they stayed there before they passed over. So here's the 3 days and the 3 nights in these pink brackets where the spies were hiding out in the mountains. They came back, and of course, Joshua had said that they were going to have 3 days to cross the Jordan. That's the blue bracket. That was the first one we did. So you can see that these 2 timelines are overlapping. Well, let's take a closer look at these timelines on the next chart. We're going to be crossing the Jordan. It is a very memorable day. I'm just picking up from the chart that you saw before. This is their 3rd day where they crossed before they're crossing the Jordan. This was a very busy night with everybody getting ready. Let's just follow these boxes as we go through. Like I said, we have our spies were returning right there after hiding for 3 days in the mountains. And then the officers were giving commands of how this Ark of the Covenant is going to go across first. And people are to sanctify themselves, for Joshua said tomorrow, and that would be the 10th day of the month. Very interesting day. The 10th day of the first month is that he's saying that there will be wonders. And he rose early in the morning, is what it says, to set out for the Jordan with Israel. The priests take up the Ark of the Covenant and they cross over before the people. So this particular day, the 10th day of the month, and remember, that was the day that they chose the lamb for the Passover sacrifice. It was the day of crossing over. In box 12, Yahuah said to Joshua, this day on the 10th, I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all of Israel. And it was on that day that about 40,000 crossed over the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. It was a really great day. Well, Tim's going to help us a little bit here on Joshua chapter 4 and what happened there.
Joshua 4, the Jordan memorial stones. When all of the people had completely crossed over the Jordan, the next divine command to Joshua was to select 12 men to represent every tribe. They were to bring memorial stones back from the riverbed of the Jordan to erect as an altar for a permanent sign of the crossing of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. Note that 10th day. What was happening on that 10th day? Were they not being chosen? The Lamb of Yahuah, the Lamb nation? Joshua 5, Men Circumcised, Joshua 5, 2-3 and 8-9. At that time, Yahuah said unto Joshua, make these sharp knives and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. Why? Because there were some of them that had not been circumcised coming through the wilderness. And Joshua made him sharp knives and circumcised the children of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And it came to pass, when they had done circumcising all the people, that they abode in their places in the camp till they were whole. And Yahuah said unto Joshua, this day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you. Wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal unto this day. And there you see there is the 3 days that they had to heal up until the Abib 13 and through that night season. So this brings us very, very close to the Passover, and they had to be healed. Yahuah is the great
Mhm.
healer, thankfully.
Mhm. So we're going to look at that little tiny chart in a lot of detail here so that you can see how this works. Because in Joshua 5, verses 2 to 9, these men are going to be circumcised. And like Tim said, this reaches to the day before Passover. So we have the men there. All of them have crossed the Jordan on the 10th day of that very first month. And as Tim already said, that they had to be circumcised because during the wilderness they were not. And it was 40 years. So it said, okay, today is the day when the rest of them are circumcised before celebrating Passover in Canaan. And the flint knives were made to circumcise the sons of Israel. And then he said, after circumcising the men, they stayed in their camp places until they were healed. Well, the question is, how long would it be till they were healed? Well, there's a little bit of an answer in Genesis 34. Remember that story about Simeon and Levi and what had happened to Dinah and Hamor? They went out and they slayed all of the Shechemites. And in verse 24, it says, every male was circumcised who went out of the gate. And then in verse 25, it says, on the third day when they were still in pain. Well, we only have 3 days here to get to Passover. So if we're going to follow the pattern in Genesis 34, it would be expected that the men will need at least 3 days of healing, hampering any desire to harvest the old or new grain of the land. On the fourth day, they should be feeling better just in time for Passover on Abib 14, the very next day. And Tim, do you have something to say about this 3 days of healing and the grain just before we go to the next slide?
Yes, I believe it was a miracle, and I believe it was fully intentional that they were circumcised for those 3 days. Because if you had been eating manna in the wilderness for 40 years and you come into a land with grain, wheat, and barley ready to eat, ready to go as had been promised, do you think that you would want to harvest that grain and eat it? Yet Yahuah had these men in a medical situation where they were not really ready to go out there and harvest the grain. They were kind of liking to just relax a little bit. I think this was fully intentional, and I think Yahuah did not want them to be harvesting that grain, and he allowed this situation to help them out.
Mm-hmm. So this is our third set of counting to 3. You can see how it works there. Very, very simple, but very important. Okay, Tim, we have some more review here.
Joshua will confirm. Abib 11 was the 4th cycle of the week. Abib 11, you'll see that colored in red for a very specific reason, which we just discussed. That is when the circumcising had begun, just after they crossed the Jordan. Now, number 2, Enoch calendar claims that Abib 1 is always placed on the 4th cycle, which would be a Wednesday in pagan terms. So where is the 11th on that calendar? On Enoch's calendar, Abib 11 is always claims a weekly Shabbat. Why would they be circumcising on a weekly Shabbat? Again, the scriptures which show Joshua's entry into Canaan does not agree with Enoch's reckoning. It is at odds with Enoch. I should say Enoch is at odds with the scripture. The first Passover is celebrated in Canaan, Joshua 5:10. And the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even in the plains of Jericho. At this point, we are still assuming that Passover will be on the Shabbat on Abib 14. It will be exposed solidly later in this study. And the question is, can the Passover and the weekly Shabbat share the same day without scriptural conflict? Yes, there are people that claim that the Passover cannot land on the 7th-day Sabbath. There is a whole religious society that claims this. Is the scripture in agreement? We need to look at this very, very carefully. What have you been taught? And what is written in the scriptures? Are they two different things? Let's remember, no manna is sent on the Shabbat.
Yes, and this Passover on a seventh-day Sabbath with a great big question mark, absolutely. There are so many people that say, can Passover really occur on the weekly Sabbath? Should Passover ever be celebrated on a weekly Sabbath? Or you know what else? Some say, shouldn't the festal calendar just be adjusted so that Passover never falls on a weekly Sabbath? And those are all important questions. We recognize that. So below, we're going to look at two festal calendars from, one is from covenant calendar, but one is just a lunisolar festal calendar. And they're from 2015 and 2016. The first is a 2015 lunar solar festal calendar. And on this calendar, they actually show the proper placement of the wave sheaf. They have the 4th, April 4th there as Passover. And you can see that the 5th is marked as the first fruits day. And of course, the 5th is also going to be the unleavened bread and the first fruits together. They're sharing the same date together. On the 2016 covenant feast calendar, that year it was April 2 was a Passover. It's exactly the same this year, except for the dates are a little bit different, but it's the same calendar. And then the 3rd was the wave sheaf, and that was also the unleavened bread festival, the high day Sabbath, right? So there is a lunar solar festal calendar. This particular one, this camp does have first fruits on the day following the weekly Sabbath. So there are some that do it correctly, and there are some that have their first fruits on Abib 16, always and ever, and there's no discussion. Well, let's do a little bit review about that, Tim.
Number 3, Joshua will be celebrating Abib 14 Passover on the weekly Shabbat. Yes, you're going to hear about this several times. We are going to stress that because this is very important. There is no need to adjust the date. Adjust the date. Do we recall in John 7 where Yahuah said, your time is always ready? Why did he say that? Because he knew very, very well how many times they had adjusted the date. Number 3A, many Jewish calendars are adjusted to avoid the celebration of certain feasts on the weekly Shabbat. Again, Yahush's words in John 7, your time is always ready. And here, Passover and the Day of Atonement are two of these feasts that they adjust so that they're not on the weekly Shabbat. Is that scriptural?
Yes, we're going to find out. Now, does this Sabbath Passover demand servile work? Because there's so many saying, well, you know what, you have to work. And so it just can't be on a Sabbath, that just doesn't work. So that's why we have to move it. And well, that's a good question. We should figure that out. Even today, there's many of the Jews' calculations for their Jewish festivals. They're very arbitrary. They're set by men and they're not set by scripture. And they're lots of times set by convenience. Their annual festivals can be off as much as 2 days from the original day ordained by their own Jewish calendar commands, especially if the annual feasts occur on or close to weekly Sabbath. But there is no scriptural command to exempt Passover from falling on a weekly Sabbath. We can't find anything about that. And as has been noted, the preparations for Passover can be done on the preparation day or the Friday before the Sabbath. And that extra Passover sacrifice that was happening back then, it was not a Sabbath violation anyway, according to scripture, because the Sabbath had double the sacrifices over the daily sacrifices. So does a Sabbath Passover work? Absolutely. There's no reason to remove Passover and to put it on the day before or the day after. Joshua is really clear about that. So the unleavened bread for the first Passover in Canaan. Let's get started. Even though Israel was in the land of Canaan with grain all around them, the scriptural command was very firm. Israel was not allowed to touch any of the old grain or the new grain for their unleavened bread at the Passover meal on Abib 14. Remember, they were still having manna, and so they must have used manna somehow. We're not really sure how they did that. And also remember, we are still assuming that Passover is on the seventh-day Sabbath. The first partaking of unleavened bread from grain became part of the festival only on Abib 15, after the wave sheaf ceremony was completed, as it says in Leviticus 23:6. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto Yahuah. Well, let's place the first Sabbath of unleavened bread onto our chart. It is going to be Abib 15. So this is chart number 5 of 7, and it's about the unleavened bread placement. We know Passover is always on the 14th, and unleavened bread is commanded to be on the 15th. So the children kept the Passover, it tells us, on the 14th day of the month at even. This is in the evening time, Arab. That's when they kept it on the plains of Jericho. And as you know, the Passover night was very special. And if we remember the original Passover commands from Exodus 12, this is what it says. They shall eat the flesh on that night, and any of it that is left until morning, you shall burn with fire. You shall not leave any of that flesh until morning, and any of it that is left until morning, you shall burn with fire. The instructions are very, very clear. This is talking about the Passover lamb, and this links to Yahushua and what was happening with him on his Passover day. So at the end of the Passover night, that is where you have your day start coming in for Abib 15. The cycle exchange is right there. You have your Abib 15 first day of unleavened bread. This is a high Sabbath, as you all know. And then you have the night, the Abib 15 night. But remember, everybody, we are still assuming that Passover was the day before on the 14th. Well, let's look at this connection between Passover on the 14th and wave sheaf on the 15th. Joshua 5:11 is a very important verse, and if we just read it literally, we would understand what's happening. And they did eat of the old corn or the old grain of the land on the morrow after Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the self same day. Well, this Hebrew definition for morrow is very, very interesting. I took it from Brown Driver Briggs because he really nails it down. It's the morrow or tomorrow or the day after. It doesn't get any clearer than that. So none of these definitions, there's nothing in here to say that the tomorrow starts anywhere near around sunset. Let's take a little further look at this scripture, because John 5:11 is very specific that this grain is eaten on the tomorrow after the Passover. I want you to note that the tomorrow, it begins with boker, morning, twilight, mixture of light. Boker, first thing in the morning. And the Wave Sheaf Festival has no other choice but to start with that first light in the morning. Finally, after the Wave Sheaf ceremony, Israel was finally allowed to take of the old or the new grain to make some unleavened bread according to the statute. So we have now got Wave Sheaf is established on Abib 15 in this particular year, but we're still assuming that Passover was on the seventh-day Sabbath. Tim, let's have a little look at this slide.
Passover on the seventh-day Sabbath? Really? Yes. Number 4, Joshua has confirmed wave sheaf occurred on Abib 15, the morrow after Passover, not Abib 16, the morrow after the first unleavened bread Sabbath. And I hope that is well understood. It is the morrow after the Shabbat, the weekly Shabbat, not after the Unleavened Bread Sabbath. As you see there on the left, that 15th, or the wave sheaf, on the left in green, is the first day of the week. That comes directly after the seventh day Sabbath. Joshua 5:11, and they did eat of the old corn or grain of the land when? On the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the self-same day. This is a vital verse. This tells you exactly what happened and when, and exactly what statutes were being obeyed. We still need to confirm if the morrow after the Passover is indeed also the morrow after the weekly Shabbat. And the question is, are both these morrows on Abib 15? How can that be?
Well, we're going to get into the thick of this study right now. Let's read Leviticus 23 first, because Moses gives some very interesting instructions for wave sheaf. He says, speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, when you come into the land, and this is going to be under the leadership of Joshua, when you come into the land which I give you and shall reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. This is a command with a when you do it, then you will do this. When you come in, then you do that. So wave sheaf was not celebrated in the wilderness. That was a prophecy that they had to wait 40 years to have fulfillment. In Numbers 15, it also says, when you come into the land whither I bring you, then it shall be that when you eat of the bread of the land, you shall offer up a heave offering or a wave sheaf unto Yahuah. Remember, I told you Leviticus 23 and Numbers 15 are two major witnesses. So these two verses, along with Joshua 5:11, are very specific. They are telling us that wave sheaf will be celebrated in Canaan and not in the wilderness. So this next verse in Leviticus 23:11 is a prophecy of what is going to happen. And this is where we're going to get into the thick of this study. Let's look at it a little bit closer. Leviticus 23:11. And he shall wave the sheaf before Yahuah for your acceptance. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest waves it. Morrow after the Sabbath? What type of Sabbath is this verse referring to? Is it the weekly Sabbath, or is it the first Sabbath of unleavened bread, which is a high Sabbath? We need to ask that question. Which morrow is it? In other words, is wave sheaf established on what? The morrow after the weekly Sabbath? Or is it established on the morrow after the unleavened bread Sabbath, the high Sabbath? Because if wave sheaf comes after the unleavened bread high Sabbath, guess what? It isn't going to be after Passover. But we are still assuming that Passover is on the seventh day Sabbath. Well, we will look at what Moses has to say about Sabbath. In Leviticus 23:11, I've read the verse already, but do you notice that this particular Sabbath is 7676? Tim, do you want to read that Strong's definition?
Shabbat, Strong's H7676, Shabbat, intensive from H7673, an intermission, specifically the Shabbat. H7676 is specific, noting the Leviticus 23:11 Shabbat is the weekly Shabbat, as designated by the Hebrew word number H7676. However, that raises a question, as most believe that the first day of unleavened bread is also a Shabbat. Are the feast Sabbaths connected to the Hebrew number H7676? 7:6? Very important question. What is the answer? No and yes. Well, what kind of an answer is that? That tells us that we need to dig in.
Yes, that is a very interesting answer because the answer is no and yes. So we're going to be looking at a lot of Strong's numbers here, and I really want you to try to follow. Now, we don't always rely on Strong's numbers for, giving witnesses, but in this particular study, it is a very strong witness. So let's look at 7677. This is Shabbaton, and it's from 7676, a Sabbatism or a special holiday. And it does say that it's a rest. Well, guess what? There are some examples of 7677 feast Sabbaths, and you'll find them at the first day of the Feast of Trumpets there in Leviticus 23:24, and also the first and the 8th days of the Feast of Tabernacles. And there is one 7676 feast Sabbath, which is Day of Atonement. This is the very most holy, solemn Sabbath of the year, is Day of Atonement. Yes, it is the only feast Sabbath connected to this number 7676, the Day of Atonement, because basically it's a little bit higher than the weekly Sabbath for everything that happens on it. So we have some questions coming up here. Are the Unleavened Bread Sabbaths, there's 2 of them, are they connected to either of these word numbers, 7676 or 7677? Let's look and see what it says in Leviticus 23:5-6, and pay attention to these numbers. In the 14th day of the first month at even is Yahuah's Passover. And then it says, on the 15th day of the same month is a feast, 28/20/82, of unleavened bread unto Yahuah. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In verse 7, in the first day, this is the first day of unleavened bread, the high Sabbath, you shall have a holy, 69:44, a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work. You see, convocation has the number 4744. The festival Sabbaths of the first and 7 days of unleavened bread and also Pentecost are not numbered with either of these numbers. But the unleavened bread Sabbaths are listed as holy or Kadesh convocations. That's interesting, but they do not have the number 7676 connected to them. There's so many important things that we need to watch with these Hebrew definitions. So let's look at what some of these are. The Feast of Unleavened Bread in the Strongs is 2282. Kag, I think, is how you say it. It says it's a festival. It is a solemn feast day. That's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The word holy, 6944, you've probably heard many people say Kodesh instead of holy. It means sacred, consecrated, hallowed, holiness. Absolutely, something wonderful happening with that word. And convocation in the Strongs is 4744. It's Makra. Look what it says. It's a public meeting. It's a rehearsal, an assembly, something that's being called out. So we have a lot of numbers here to look at. I have them listed there at the top. Remember, 7676 refers to the weekly Sabbath, and 7677 is referring to those feast Sabbaths in the fall. And then we have these other 3 numbers. These Hebrew numbers are all linked to worship statutes, whether they're weekly Sabbaths or annual Sabbaths. But have you noted that the phrases that have Feast of Unleavened Bread and Holy Convocation that have these other numbers, they are never ever listed as a weekly Sabbath. They're never together with the Hebrew number 7676. And they're not listed as an annual feast Sabbath with the number 7677? Well, there's a pretty good reason for that. We're going to look at it right now. The reason is that these Hebrew definitions confirm the wave sheaf placement. This is one of our most important slides. Wave sheaf does not follow the holy convocation of the first unleavened bread Sabbath of Abib 15. In the year that Joshua was crossing the Jordan, the wave sheaf follows only the 7676 weekly Sabbath, which was Abib 14, we're saying, and that is on Abib 15, because after the Sabbath of the Passover Sabbath, we have the unleavened bread Sabbath, which is a high Sabbath. So wave sheaf is not following a Sabbath with a 7676, and it doesn't follow these numbers here. Okay, it follows the 7676 Sabbath. Now I'd like you to take note. On the very next slide, we have a very important demonstration. It's going to demonstrate 2 covenant statutes of what happens at every single Passover. It's going to show you what happens on the day after Passover every single year. And it's going to show you what happens on the day after the weekly Sabbath in the Passover week every single year. And the question is, will Joshua have something to say about these 2 special statutes? I'm calling them 2 covenant calendar statutes. And by the way, I have not seen this example anywhere else in the scriptures at all. This is the only place, and Joshua is the one that nails it down. So like I said, we're going to look at 2 day afters. We're going to look at what happens on the day after, a statute on the day after Passover in any single year. We're going to look at what happens on the day after the 7th day Sabbath in any year, even if it's after Passover or on Passover, it doesn't really matter. So let's start with number 1 first. The day after Passover, it says in Leviticus 23:6, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto Yahuah. There is no shortage of information here to understand that Passover is on the 14th, on Abib 15th is the first unleavened bread Sabbath. It always works that way every single year. Well, what about the day after the 7th day Sabbath? Leviticus 23:11 is the verse. It says, and he shall wave the sheaf before Yahuah for your acceptance on the morrow after, this is a weekly Sabbath, is when the priest is supposed to wave it. So every single year, when you get to your Sabbath within the week of the Passover festival, the day after the weekly Sabbath is always the wave sheaf ceremony, every single year. It doesn't matter what day of the week Passover is on. But look what happens in Joshua. He fulfills both of these calendar statutes in absolute perfection. Here in Joshua 5:11, most important verse, and they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the self same day. So what's happening here is that we're actually dealing with 2 morrows, not 1, there's 2. The very first cycle is the wave sheaf ceremony. That was tomorrow. That was when the wave sheaf was supposed to be waved. And that always follows the Sabbath. And then the second tomorrow was Abib 15. And we know Abib 15 always follows Abib 14. So in Joshua's example, Abib 14 Passover happens to be on the 7th day Sabbath. So his verse here in Joshua 5:11 actually fulfills both of these tomorrows. And this only happens when Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath, like it does this year. It's very, very interesting. We're going to look at chart number 6 of 7, and it's going to put Passover, wave sheaf, and unleavened bread together. Because now we know that wave sheaf is going to follow the weekly Sabbath. Don't forget that the children kept their Passover. We now know that Passover for sure was on a weekly Sabbath. That's where they kept their Passover. They had their Passover night, and they were eating the flesh in that night, burning all the leftovers before the morning. But we do know that the wave sheaf is going to be the day after the weekly Sabbath, not the day after the unleavened bread Sabbath, because they ate the grain of the land on the morrow after that Passover day, on the same day is what it says. So wave sheaf is on Abib 15, and it follows Passover within the Passover week. Now, we finally have confirmation that Passover was on a Sabbath there in the book of Joshua. It didn't have to be moved to Friday, and it didn't have to be moved to the day after the unleavened bread Sabbath. The wave sheaf is the morrow after the Passover, and the wave sheaf is the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. Right there. In fact, I'm going to put it first. Abib 15 is wave sheaf and the unleavened bread. So wave sheaf does not follow the morrow after the unleavened bread Sabbath, way over here. In fact, it can't go any other place but to follow the weekly Sabbath. It's just that easy. Well, I was just wondering if Tim would be here to do our review number 5, and if he's not, I'll just go ahead.
I'm present.
Joshua, there he is. Okay.
Number 5, Joshua confirms we must pay attention to which Shabbat days are understood as H7676 Shabbats or H7677 Shabbaton. The differences are huge. Wave sheaf always follows only the H7676 Shabbat within the Passover week, within the Passover festal week. Unleavened bread always follows Abib 14 Passover. This is things that we need to know. We need to know the difference between the two different Sabbaths, 7676 and 7677. This is very vital.
I think there's going to be a quiz after this because we're talking about this quite a bit. So wave sheaf never, ever follows days linked to these Hebrew numbers. Don't want you to forget it. If you see these Hebrew numbers of 2822, feast for Kag, 6944 for holy or Kadesh, or 4744 for convocation, no, wave sheaf doesn't follow those days. You know what, everybody? Even if it looks like it, okay? Now, there can be some calendars, you know, when we have Passover on a Friday, that happened last year, and then you will have your high Sabbath following the Friday Passover, and you will have it, of course, that high Sabbath on a weekly Sabbath. And then the wave sheaf is coming here. Now, why do I say that wave sheaf never follows the Feast of Unleavened Bread Sabbath? Because the Torah instructions are saying that the wave sheaf follows the weekly Sabbath. Even if the high Sabbath is there, the wave sheaf is actually following the weekly Sabbath. It is not following just the high Sabbath. And the high Sabbath does show up. But always remember that it follows that weekly Sabbath. And this is not a sample of the year for Joshua 5. I'm just showing you what happens when a Passover is on a Friday or a 6th cycle. So we'll just do a little bit review on this. The covenant calendar fact, it's an if-when, okay? Wave sheaf follows the first Sabbath of unleavened bread on Abib 16 occasionally, but it's an if and a when statement. When Passover falls on the Friday, right there, you have a first Sabbath of unleavened bread, always on the 15th. That will be the 15th. And it happens to be a weekly Sabbath as well. But as I said to you, the wave sheaf on Abib 16th is first following that weekly Shabbat. It does not just follow the high Sabbath. And this happens about once every 6 to 7 years. Now, there's a lot of Jewish calendars and lunar calendars, festal calendars that don't follow the Jewish calendar all the way, that do say that the 16th, our wave sheaf always follows on the 16th, no matter what. So that means that no matter where your Passover is, this 16th date is going to float anywhere in that calendar week. It's a very important note. So far, there's been a lot of emphasis placed on these Hebrew numbers to prove that wave sheaf follows this weekly Sabbath within the Passover festival. And we all know that Hebrew scholars have generated these Hebrew numbers, so you can't always fully trust them. But while they can show and serve to give us some truth about the matter, there also needs to be a second witness for proof. And we're going to establish that with the placement of Pentecost. It won't be here in this particular study. So Tim, I'd like you to do a review of this slide.
Number 6, Joshua confirms the wave sheaf. Number 1, he confirms it on Abib 15, the day after Passover. Number 2, it follows the H7676 weekly Shabbat. Therefore, Passover was celebrated on the weekly Shabbat, or the 7th day Sabbath. Number 6a, Enoch has every Passover celebration on the 3rd cycle of the week each year. How can this be? You see down there, the 14th is colored red. This version of the Enoch calendar demands that each and every year. Problem is, the scriptures don't portray that at all. The scriptures have something quite different than what Enoch declares. Number 7, Joshua confirms the weekly Shabbat was on Abib 14. And here's just a tiny bit of a little bunny trail with the Shabbat being on Abib 14. The lunar Sabbaths fall on the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and 29th, according to the phases of the moon. How does that work out with Joshua? Joshua does not allow weekly lunar Sabbaths to have recognition on Yahuah's calendar. Joshua does not recognize a lunar Shabbat calendar. It's not written in the scriptures. It's not Yahuah's way.
Yes, in fact, there's even a lot of examples that we're finding in the covenant calendar studies that shows that lunar Sabbaths just do not work, especially in that study that you did, Tim, with Moses and raising up the sanctuary. Very interesting. Lunar Sabbaths just do not work. Anyway, finally, we have an understanding of wave sheaf. And the discovery also eliminates 2 other false teachings. The false teaching that wave sheaf must always be celebrated on Abib 16, and the false teaching that wave sheaf must always follow a feast Sabbath, specifically the high Sabbath of unleavened bread. Well, I'm sure glad that Joshua sets the record straight. In fact, he's confirmed so very, very, very well that wave sheaf must follow the weekly Sabbath during the Passover week. So I want you to note that scripture records 3 Passovers that are very easy to find and to calculate according to what Moses' calendar was from leaving Egypt, Joshua from leaving the wilderness into Canaan, and from Yahushua. There's 3 that are really easy to find. There's many more than that, but there are 3. So next, we're going to look at a chart. Actually, we'll look at 2 charts. Put them both together. That might help you a little bit, of Passovers and wave sheaf and how they can be illustrated, how you can figure this out for easy and for once and for all. First of all, you need to remember that Passover days of the week are flexible. The Passover day, the 14th day of the week, is flexible. But when it comes to wave sheaf, it's the date that is flexible, not the day of the week. It's the date that is flexible. Just a little chart here. We know that Abib 14 is always Passover, and we know that the wave sheaf always follows the day after the weekly Sabbath. So if you have a Passover on a Sunday or the first day of the week, you have to wait till the next Sunday to get to your wave sheaf. If your Passover 14th is on a Monday, remember, these days are flexible. They can float throughout the calendars. Then you still wait till the next Sunday for your wave sheaf. But now the date has changed. It will be the 20th instead of the 21st. If you have a Tuesday Passover like Moses did when he took the children out of the land of Egypt, that was on a Tuesday, the 14th, but the wave sheaf, it was on the 19th, always on the first day of the week. And of course, Wednesday is the year of Yahushua's crucifixion and his Passover. That was on the Wednesday, the fourth cycle. Still, wave sheaf is on the Sunday, the first day of the week, but the date is different. And Thursday and Friday, you can see the same thing. And here we are with Joshua recording that Sabbath was that year was a Passover, and you get Sunday, the very next day is the wave sheaf. So there you have 3 easy Passovers to find in the scriptures: Moses, Yahushua's, and Joshua's. And they're all very, very, with Moses is extremely important study to find the Pentecost count. Well, just in case you want to see the chart a little bit different, I just set it up so that you can see the days of wave sheaf and how they are working through with these different dates of, not dates, the different days for Passover over here: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Sabbath for Joshua. And you can see it's really easy. We have all these 7 days of unleavened bread. Sorry about that. Let's go back. All these days of unleavened bread up here at the top, because Passover always has those 7 days. So if your Passover is on a Sunday, you go all the way through, get to your weekly Sabbath. There's wave sheaf right there. If your Passover is on a Monday, you travel all the way through your festival week to your Sabbath. Wave sheaf is right there. Same with Tuesday and Wednesday. You just travel to your Sabbath. There's wave sheaf. You can see how it works every single year. So when Joshua had a Passover Sabbath, you just have to go the next day and you have wave sheaf. So what's the point here? Joshua followed these instructions in the Torah to the letter. It's actually really pretty easy. So a date and or a day are usually not the same. I'm just going to give you a random example here. On this calendar, the 15th date is on the 4th day cycle or on a Wednesday. But guess what? It doesn't happen that way every year. Passover isn't on a Tuesday every single year, like a lot of the Enoch calendars say. So these dates will flex on the calendar. They can be on any day of the week. But like we said with wave sheaf, it is always defaulting to the first day after the weekly Sabbath. So let's look at these 3 different years of Moses, Yahushua, and Joshua together. I'm just leaving this little table up here just for a reference, just so that you can see it. We've done these studies before, but this is just a little review. The year of Moses, he had a Passover on the 14th, and all you do is go to the Sabbath, and there's the wave sheaf right there. For Yahushua's year, his Passover was on a Wednesday. Really simple. You go to Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, and his ascension was on wave sheaf right there, the day following. And we've already done this with Joshua. His Passover was on a Sabbath, and you just right there, the very next day is the wave sheaf. Joshua confirms that covenant calendar's wave sheaf is in direct opposition to Enoch's wave sheaf placement. And why is that? Because Enoch's wave sheaf is always, I'm going to say always in this case, on Abib 26. It is outside the week of the Passover festival. Remember, we said that if there's one thing wrong in another calendar, that it's going to pretty much knock out the whole calendar. So we've had Joshua's Passover calendar here. You can take a look at it for a comparison. And on Enoch's Passover, the Enoch calendar that we're using today for demonstration has Tuesday Passover. They don't do their wave sheaf on the day after the weekly Sabbath. They choose the 26th of Abib. It's a week after. Does that look like a problem to you? Well, here's a slide from their presentation. You can see what they have to say here. They talk about these Sabbath dates for Enoch in the first month are on the 4th, 11th, 18th, and the 25th, okay? And the 26th is the first fruits waving of the sheaf offering. So Enoch has his first fruits outside of the Passover festival, spring festival. It's outside. We've done some work on that as well. Tim, would you like to finish up this slide here? Coming up next.
Yes, we have done a lot of work. There's quite a series of these studies in Joshua, and they're with much more detail, and I would like to see, or I would like to recommend everybody go through them. This one here, Joshua's witness, is easy to understand. Observation. Many that honor Yahuah's festivals suggest the wave sheaf must always be celebrated on Abib 16, and it must follow the first Shabbat of unleavened bread. This is not true, as shown through Joshua's testimony. Again, we have many studies that get into great detail on this specific situation. The information from Joshua 5:10 to 11 clearly eliminates these two false teachings. In fact, it is impossible for wave sheaf to be placed on Abib 16 in this account with Joshua. However, this is not to say wave sheaf can never be on Abib 16, just that wave sheaf is not always placed on Abib 16. The scriptural support of wave sheaf is of most importance. Besides Joshua, support is found in Leviticus 23, Exodus 12, 16, and 19, and the gospel account. But this information raises another question. Joshua confirms wave sheaf can be celebrated on Abib 16 if Passover falls on the 6th cycle. See, you see there in the red, Passover is on the 14th, on the 6th cycle. So where is the wave sheaf? On the left, you see in green, it is on Abib 16. Why? Because that is on the first cycle of the week, and it does follow the 7th-day Sabbath. So sometimes it's just fine if the wave sheaf is on Abib 16, but there is a very, very serious problem if it's demanded to always be on Abib 16, and we are going to look at that. The Shabbat is Abib 15, with the first Shabbat of unleavened bread, and the wave sheaf follows on Abib 16. About once every 6 to 7 years, wave sheaf and first unleavened bread Shabbat share the same date. It does happen occasionally. Number 10, there is a question that should be pondered when the wave sheaf and first Shabbat of unleavened bread share the same date of Abib 15.
Yeah, that is a good question. Absolutely. So as we finish up here today in part 1, we know that every feast and festival is of utmost importance, whether it's an annual Sabbath or not. And in Joshua's account, 2 festivals share Abib 15. It's the first Sabbath of unleavened bread and the wave sheaf festival. But the question is, which festival secures the first place? Which one gets priority? Is it wave sheaf or is it unleavened bread Sabbath, the high Sabbath? Will Joshua give priority to one of them? And will Joshua make the right choice? And the other question is, does it really matter? So in part 2, we're going to be looking at that specific question. With wave sheaf and first Sabbath of unleavened bread, both on Abib 15, which one actually is going to take priority? And which one is going to be the backbone of our salvation? And Tim's going to show you that very, very clearly in part 2. So we'd like to invite you to come and see as we delve into that. So this is the end of part 1. We just want to thank you so much for being with us today. And if there's any questions or comments on the placement of Wave Sheaf in part 1, you better send us a little question there to questions@studythecalendar.com. Thank you for being with us today, and hope you enjoy part 2.